Welcome to Get Your Books Out, and thank you for joining us. Bringing you the best books you may have never heard of from the world of land, sea and air. Gripping adventure stories and tales of military daring-do, tomfoolery, incompetence and genius. If you like our channel, please share, like and subscribe. Chapter 4. Call yourself a bandmaster? What Collard saw when he went onto the quarterdeck displeased him greatly. There were guests without dancing partners. This might have been understandable as it was the first dance of the night, but it made no difference to the Admiral. He headed straight for Captain Dewar. Now, Dewar and his commander had taken special steps to ensure that a proportion of officers took turns to refrain from dancing with their own personal guests. Instead, they were to spend the time effecting introductions. A roster had been made out, and on it, Dewar had restricted himself to only 3 dances, and he was doing his duty as a host when Collard hurried over to him and, quite out of the blue, and with no preamble at all, demanded, "You are to make the commander introduce people. You are to bite him. If you don't send for him and bite him, I will." Dewar was prompt enough to point out that Daniel was already dancing with a complete stranger. But he was so astonished by such an unexpected attack that he hardly knew what to say next. Moreover, Collard was using his "Hail the Crow's Nest" voice, and a captain does not expect to be addressed like that on his own quarterdeck, particularly in front of guests. Collard saw his hesitation and snapped, "If you don't, I will make you rue it." He thundered off, this time with another bone to pick. If he had not liked what he had seen, then he most certainly did not like what he was hearing. He was standing by the bandstand when that dance ended, and, as Daniel passed with his partner, he stopped him and said he wished to have words. The commander could see by the Admiral's expression that all was very far from well. So he took his guest to a chair by the side of the quarterdeck and hurried back to Collard, who promptly ordered him to dismiss the Royal Marine Band and replace it with the Volunteer Sailors' Jazz Group. Pointing to Barnacle and his men, he stormed, "I never heard such an awful row in my life. Everyone is complaining of it." Daniel tried to explain that the programme had already been arranged between the 2 bands, but the Admiral would have none of his excuses. "If you cannot tell them, I will tell them myself. Come with me." Poor Dewar. Not only had he been shouted at on his own quarterdeck, but now Collard was ordering his commander about, without having the grace to consult him first. The Admiral and Daniel took a few paces to the front of the bandstand and stopped. Collard pointed his finger, beckoning for Barnacle to approach. Marines are rarely summoned by Admirals, and Barnacle hastily obeyed. As he stood sharply to attention, Collard bawled at him, "You call yourself a bandmaster? You are not fit to be in any ship, let alone a flagship. I have never heard such a bloody noise in my life." Royal Oak's quarterdeck was broad and long, and, with all the chatter of the officers and their guests, most of those further away in the stern of the ship, waiting for the band to start playing again, were unaware of what was going on. But not those near at hand. The surrounding officers and their dancing partners hastily withdrew, startled and embarrassed. It was for all the world like a host and hostess having a blazing row during a formal dinner party. According to Daniel, the Admiral then lowered his voice to a more conversational level, and he hoped the storm was over. But Collard said, "Commander, that bandmaster is to go home tomorrow. I will not have him in the ship." The storm was not blown out yet. Raising his voice again, and still only a yard or so away from the band, Collard exclaimed, "I won't have a bugger like that in my ship." Nobody ever knew for certain how many guests heard the Admiral's explosion. Most of them were far too polite to comment, at least until they were back ashore. But, to put it mildly, his voice was robust and would have carried a fair way even if the music had not stopped. Bandmaster Percy Barnacle was more than dumbfounded. He was shattered. All his life he had been an instinctive subscriber to the doctrine, "God bless the squire and his relations, and keep us in our proper stations." Even in later civilian life, he persisted in calling his family doctor Sir. As far as he was concerned, an admiral was an admiral, and a Royal Marine Bandmaster a humble underling by comparison. But both had their proper roles to play, and were to be respected in their performance. To be abused in such a way was more than he could comprehend. Commander Daniel decided to take charge. He said to Barnacle, "You are to play the next dance and have given orders that the jazz band is to come aft and relieve you." He then sought out the first lieutenant and told him to round up the sailors members of the amateur band. Things did not go as smoothly as he hoped. Even in so brief a time, a report of the Admiral's behaviour had reached the lower deck. The jazz band were in two minds whether they would perform at all, and as they were volunteers, no one could order them to play. The first lieutenant sent for Daniel, who finally persuaded them. Even so, he had to take care that the dismissed Marine band and the sailors did not meet on the way to the quarterdeck. A muttered word or two, and Royal Oak's dance could have collapsed in scandal and disaster. Instead, it ended most successfully, spiced as it was with a touch of high drama. But at the end of the evening, as the anxious and indignant Dewar, tall and elegant in his black bow tie, stiff shirt and mess dress, was seeing his guests over the side, Collard approached him again. His voice had lost none of its bellow, and, according to Dewar, his manner was excited. Again he was demanding that Percy Barnacle be sent home the next day, that the band playing had been disgraceful, and that he would not have him in his flagship. Dewar did his best to shield his parting visitors from another scene by edging away from the turbulent Admiral. Yet, for the sake of his position, he had to protect his crew, and, before extricating himself, he insisted that the band was above average and pointed out how much trouble Barnacle had taken in training the sailors' jazz band, all voluntary work for the ship. But Collard simply raised his voice even louder. "You can have him in your ship. I won't have him in mine." Sparing the ears of the parting guests, Dewar moved away into the shadows. Party over and quarterdeck deserted. The wardroom bar was open once again, and the Royal Oak's officers spent an intriguing hour or two holding an inquest. In the Royal Marines mess the talk was uglier. Among his sympathetic fellow senior non-commissioned officers, Percy Barnacle was beginning to calm down, though his sense of outrage was increased by the hurt of being called a bugger. It was not the word itself. Although Barnacle never swore and was deeply religious, he had been at sea for far too long to take offence at a careless swear word. It was a fact that an admiral had used it, and used it in such a situation. Barnacle made up his mind. He would resign from the Royal Marines the next morning. If only Rear Admiral Collard had approached the bandmaster in a gentler fashion, and asked him, as man to man, what he thought of the band's performance, things might have been very different. For privately, Percy Barnacle had great contempt for the musicians the Royal Marines had provided, and called them a squeegee band, which, for a non-swearer, was pretty strong stuff. Also, his clarinetist was an alcoholic who managed to lay his hands on far more of the crew's daily rum ration than was good for him. Friday the 13th, the following morning, did not start at all well aboard Royal Oak. The approaches to the Admiral's day cabin on the upper deck, and the cabin flat leading to it, lost much of their monastic calm. Normally a tranquil haven of glittering bars and spotless paintwork, surveyed by a contemplative sentry in white cap cover and pipe-clad belt, now there was a certain commotion about the place. First, the Church of England chaplain, the Reverend Harry Golding, demanded an audience of the Admiral, and Collard agreed to see him. Unlike the other services, naval chaplains, although they wear officers' uniforms, have cabins and mess in the wardroom, have no badges of rank. This can be a considerable disadvantage when facing the gold braid of a full-grown Rear Admiral, but now Collard had caught a tiger by the tail. Golding was no way-faced curate, but a man who had served as a seaman on the lower deck during the late war, and was not given to blushing nor stammering. Bandmaster Barnacle had seen him earlier, in what the chaplain described as great agony of mind, and had told him that he wished to leave the ship, to resign from the Royal Marines, even if it meant foregoing his pension. What was more, a number of the bandsmen wanted to quit Royal Oak forthwith. "I wish to see you," said Golding to his Admiral. "I have heard you call the bandmaster a bugger." Collard instantly and hotly denied this. He demanded to know who had told the chaplain this, but Golding refused to say. Stormily, Collard gave his personal word of honour that Golding could contradict the story whenever he heard it mentioned. Almost immediately afterwards, the startled chaplain thought that the Admiral was about to attack him as a furious Collard rose from his roll-top desk and raised his arm. In fact, he was seeking his bell-push. He wanted Dewar, and rapidly. The moment Dewar entered the day cabin, his cap with its gilded peak under his arm, Collard exploded and told him what the chaplain had said. Dewar promptly answered that he had used the word bugger, adding, "The commander told me you did." The Admiral reached for his bell-push again. Within minutes, Commander Daniel had joined them. Collard's first words were, "Commander, the chaplain has been aft here and told me that I called the bandmaster a bugger. Now, you were there and can bear me out that I did nothing of the sort, did I?" picking his words with all the care of an old lady walking down an icebound garden path. Daniel replied, "If you ask me whether you called him a bugger, I say no. But if you ask me whether you referred to him as a bugger in the presence of the band, I say yes." This fine distinction did nothing to soothe the Admiral. He swore on his honour he had never used the word. What is more, it was not in his vocabulary. By now he was in a furious temper, and shouted something about it all ending in a court-martial, but whose court-martial he did not define. However, Daniel persisted. He told Collard that nothing would make him budge from a statement that he knew to be correct. Later, another storm blew up. Major Claude Atwood, commanding officer of Royal Oak's Royal Marine Detachment, arrived on board from a gunnery exercise ashore. Atwood had been at the dance and, when he heard the commotion, had made to interfere. Very wisely, his dancing partner had held him back. Now he demanded to see the captain to protest at the slur on his unit, which included the band. But Dewar was as elusive and self-effacing as ever. He delegated the commander to deal with the protest. Dewar was being logical. The molehill was well on its way to becoming a mountain already. The lower the level at which any protest was made, the better. Atwood did not even try to disguise his indignation from Daniel. He made an angry protest at what he regarded as a reflection on his corps and himself. He was also inspired by a feeling that if he did not react strongly, then he would have trouble maintaining discipline in his detachment. He felt there might be trouble if he did not act at once. As it was, the band was already discouraged and outraged. Having made his case, the Royal Marine Major told Dewar that he left the matter entirely in the captain's hands. He also hinted that if the captain wanted to take matters further, then he was quite ready to help. This conversation with Daniel was interrupted by a message to join the captain in Collard's day cabin. For a second and much longer discussion with the Admiral. This time a plan was evolved. Daniel was to have an entirely free hand to interview Bandmaster Barnacle. He was to cross-examine him closely to find out if he actually heard the Admiral swear at him, and then he was to find out exactly what were Barnacle's views of the situation. In short, a peacemaking expedition. Daniel sent for Barnacle, asked him to sit down and set about his plan. It became very plain that the bandmaster knew he had been sworn at. What is more, he provided the names of 5 other bandsmen who had also heard. Then Daniel said, "The Admiral has made a very generous amend, which he has asked me to convey to you. I feel certain you will appreciate it." "Thank you very much," said Percy Barnacle, who had obviously grasped the meaning of such diplomatic niceties. He rose from his seat, saluted, and walked away. After all, it is not every day that one gets an apology, even a devious one, from an admiral. And that was the last to be heard of his threat to resign from the service. The strange thing that escaped all the officers, Admiral, Flag Captain, Commander, and Major, was that Barnacle could not have resigned even if he had wished to. Such a privilege was not open to non-commissioned officers. Daniel later claimed that Collard congratulated him afterwards. He also added that the Admiral thanked him for getting out of a damned nasty hole. This Collard heatedly denied. Major Atwood was not so easy to pacify. On the following Sunday morning, Daniel had a quiet word with him on the quarterdeck. He said that the Admiral had apologised and made redress that was satisfactory to the captain, and asked Atwood if he, too, was prepared to accept. Atwood said he would, but added darkly that, should any further incident take place, then he reserved the right to refer again to this one. That conversation was not the only effort at peacemaking on the Sabbath. Collard came ashore in his barge with a party of ladies, including his wife. They were going to attend church service. By that time, practically the whole ship's company was assembled aft. Daniel made a point of sitting next to the Admiral, while the congregation watched warily and closely. He even told Collard a joke to show on what good terms they were. After the service, Daniel went to his cabin and wrote a note to Collard, which was speedily delivered. It read, "We should esteem it a great honour if you will come to the wardroom for a cocktail, but I realise you have ladies on board, and if you cannot get away, we shall fully understand." By custom and tradition, the Admiral and his flag captain are never members of the flagship's wardroom mess, but attend only as invited guests. The Admiral came, and Daniel rounded up every officer who was available, including Major Atwood. The gathering was cordial. Collard even stayed for a second cocktail. After he left, Daniel addressed all the officers in the anteroom. He told them what had just occurred was the Western version of what the Orientals called taking their salt. The Admiral had eaten their salt. Now the incident of the dance was to be absolutely closed. So it was. No more mention was made of it, with one exception. Not long afterwards, Daniel was in the wardroom with Atwood and another officer. The Major harked back to the dance. Daniel frowned and left them. A few moments later he sent for Atwood to join him on the quarterdeck. Very formally he cautioned the Royal Marine and sent him about his business. But for a long while afterwards, as one naval wife who knew Collard wrote, bandmasters at ships' dances were inclined to be sensitive, and admirals were self-conscious about addressing them. Alas for Daniel, he had not long to wait to discover how fragile was his newly found cordiality with the Admiral. Finding his thespian tenants cramped aboard Royal Oak, he had become involved with a local dramatic society. As soon as Collard learned of this, he grumbled to his flag captain that, as Daniel had such a reputation as an entertainment's organiser, then he ought to employ his skills for the good of the ship and the service and not waste his time ashore. Chapter 5. Worse than a bloody midshipman. Throughout the week in which that remarkable dance took place, Dewar had been ashore, each afternoon playing his part in a tactical exercise with model ships on the tabletop ocean. He had been demonstrating to an audience of junior officers his pet theory that British naval battle tactics had not changed since the days of Nelson, the argument that had earned him such a mixed reception when he had had the temerity to lecture his seniors on a staff course some years before. During the week he had been deploying his wooden fleet against an opponent behaving in textbook fashion. By Friday evening the outcome was still undecided, which is hardly surprising considering each player knew the other's hand. Collard presided as umpire and arbiter. On the Saturday, less than 48 hours after the dance, the wargame party reassembled for the adjudication by Collard. There was a large audience, headed by Keyes himself, with his second-in-command, Joe Kelly. When it came to tactics, Collard was a confirmed traditionalist. Moreover, his flag captain's theories were a severe and implicit criticism of the First Sea Lord, Earl Beatty, and his tactics at the Battle of Jutland, a matter which had caused much controversy at the time and was still being argued about by historians and in naval wardrooms. Collard raised that booming voice of his and tore into Dewar and all his theories. There was no malice in what he said, simply plain scorn. As far as he was concerned, his flag captain had wasted a lot of valuable time demonstrating an idea that had been disproved over and over again. But Dewar was not to be put down so easily. Dour, aesthetic, and intellectually autocratic, he argued back. His admiral retorted by closing the exercise. It was a highly entertaining time for the audience, especially for the junior officers. Keyes was not so amused. He was a little perturbed to see one of his rear admirals and a flag captain arguing so hotly, particularly when they had been sharing the same ship for so short a time. He took Joe Kelly to one side and asked him to investigate the state of affairs aboard Royal Oak. News of the goings-on at the Thursday night dance and its repercussions had clearly not reached Admiralty House, or if it had, only the back stairs. So a couple of days later, Vice Admiral Kelly asked Collard to come and see him aboard Warship. They had a quiet and private talk. Was there any friction between Collard and Dewar? Was Collard certain? The previous Saturday had displayed some tension. Collard had denied that anything was wrong. He even praised his flag captain. It has been said that by tradition and training, Collard was the sort of man who could give no other answer. This might very well be true. Yet at the same time he must have been heavily aware that his behaviour at the dance a few nights before had put him at a sizable disadvantage with Dewar. But Kelly was satisfied, and Collard boarded his barge and returned to Royal Oak to dwell in coolly efficient and distant relationship with his flag captain. The time for the combined spring exercises with the Atlantic Fleet sailing out from home waters was approaching fast, and Royal Oak spent long days at sea in endless drill. Matters were not helped by the Mediterranean weather, which for the most part of early 1928 was unseasonably wet, sunless and rough, nor by a faulty port capstan engine that was giving Royal Oak and her forecastle officers considerable trouble. On 5th of March, a typically moody day, the ship was returning to her anchorage from exercise. It had been planned that she would reach home in darkness at about 11 p.m. Collard was due to sit in judgment at a court-martial ashore the next day, so he ordered his flag lieutenant, Burghardt, to make sure that his barge, which was lying alongside HMS Valiant in harbour, would come out and pick him up on time. It was the custom for a flag officer to leave his barge inshore while the flagship was on brief exercise, for the effort of swinging such a heavy launch inboard and outboard was labour-consuming and time-wasting, although only a day or so before Collard had told Dewar that in future he wished Royal Oak to put to sea with a full complement of boats on every occasion. Burghardt, who was no novice as an admiral's aide, but a senior lieutenant about to be promoted, made sure that Valiant received the signal. Collard then instructed him in his usual fine detail to tell Commander Daniel that he wanted gangways on both sides of the quarterdeck prepared and ready for lowering with lights and boat ropes, as he would be disembarking immediately the ship anchored. In case the weather was too rough, a Jacob's ladder and extra deck lighting were to be ready. Meanwhile, in Collard's quarters, his servant was carefully packing the full dress uniform that his master would need for the court-martial. The frock coat, the epaulettes, the gold braid, the decorations, the highly polished shoes, starched linen, the stout leather case holding sword and gilt, and black scabbard. Because of the weather, the exercise was cut short, and it soon became clear that Royal was going to return early. Collard sent Burkhardt to discover the new arrival time. The navigating bridge told him about 20:45 hours, so a new signal was made to the barge by way of Valiant. As the weather was freshening and the flagship was facing waves 6 to 8 feet high with breakers all around, Collard decided that Royal should anchor outside the breakwater for the night instead of attempting the channel into harbour. At exactly the predicted time, Royal Oak approached her anchorage wind astern. 5 minutes later, Flag Lieutenant Burkhardt went down to the Admiral's day cabin and reported that the barge had put off from Valiant. 3 minutes later, he was back to say, "The barge is coming up alongside the port side. The ship has stopped and the anchor's gone." Burkhardt was either over-optimistic or had been misinformed. On the rolling, pitching, torchlit forecastle, there was trouble. The port capstan engine was up to its old tricks and the anchor cable had jammed. All the same, at 2100 hours, Collard appeared on the quarterdeck. He found little prepared. The gangway had not been lowered, the boat rope was not rigged. If the weather was inclined to be stormy, the Admiral's temper was considerably worse. But there he stood with his flag lieutenant beside him, and his luggage-laden servant near at hand, and no one except a baffled officer of the watch to attend him. On such a night and such an occasion, he did not expect the full ceremony due to an admiral leaving his flagship, but at least his flag captain should have been in attendance and the commander there to supervise his departure. On that dark, cloudy night, lit only by the swaying deck lights, there was no sign of either. It was all due to a simple misunderstanding, or two, or three. The weather was not so very bad, just sufficient to make the crew of Royal Oak realise that they were sailors and to set carelessly stowed gear tumbling and rolling across the mess deck. But handling a great battleship of 29,000 tons at dead-so speed was never easy, particularly anchoring with a following wind. Even if the port capstan engine had been behaving itself, it was unthinkable that any Royal Navy captain would delegate the duty to even the most competent subordinate, certainly not a captain as senior as Dewar, soon to become a rear admiral himself. He was fully occupied on the navigating bridge and not in the least concerned about Collard, who that morning had expressed himself satisfied to leave the ship at 11 p.m. Now, thanks to circumstances, he was over 2 hours early. So, Captain Dewar, content that the Admiral had plenty of time to disembark at leisure, concentrated on securing his ship. He was utterly unaware that Collard had been following his service-long habit of taking things into his own hands and making personal arrangements for boarding his barge at the earliest possible moment. Dewar was busy. It was important that he got a good swing on the ship by using his engines to bring Royal Oak rapidly into the wind before he let the anchor cables run out. Normally, Commander Daniel would have been at hand to attend to the Admiral, but he had his mind on that misbehaving port capstan engine and quite rightly decided his duty was on the forecastle. It was just as well he was there, for the port anchor cable had jammed. If it could not be freed, then the ship would have to ride to her starboard anchor only. It was for a moment for experience and watchful orders. The Admiral could wait, for Daniel, like Dewar, had assumed that with Royal Oak's early arrival, the Admiral would take his time in leaving after the ship had finally swung to anchor, and the wind and sea had dictated which would be the wiser gangway to lower. Collard, obsessed with his own departure, had very different ideas. He was not going to wait for Royal Oak to settle at her anchorage. Angrily, he dispatched his flag lieutenant to bring Dewar to the port gangway, and ordered young and awed junior officer to find Daniel. The commander arrived first. In fact, with the recalcitrant port cable cleared, he was already on his way when he got the message. Furiously, Collard ordered him to lower the gangway. For the first time, Daniel understood that the Admiral was determined to leave the ship, even while she was still swinging. The operation took some minutes, with the barge, which had faced a rough passage, plunging and tossing, now and again completely out of sight, off Royal Oak's port quarter. Yet Collard was a fine seaman of the old school, and had rightly calculated that in a few moments the port side would be sheltered from the wind and that embarking aboard the launch would be simple. During the delay, Dewar arrived. He had left the bridge reluctantly, for his ship was still not at rest. Royal Oak's heaving quarterdeck was wide, but that night it was unusually well populated. Apart from the officer of the watch and his acolytes and the hands rigging the gangway, there was a section of Royal Marines doing exercise and a party of seamen under punishment, being found work for reluctant hands to do. Most of them were to have a happy time listening to authority falling out. For as Collard's voice matched his fury, many a wind-borne word came their way. Dewar, for his part, had the benefit of every harsh word. Collard stormed that he could not get a single order obeyed in the bloody ship. No ladder, no nothing. He shouted that he was treated worse than a midshipman, that he would not stay in the rotten ship, and would ask to have his flag shifted. Dewar, in his turn, demanded that the Admiral tell him of a single occasion when his orders had not been carried out, and then, more quietly, and in an effort to bring some decorum into the proceedings, said that he would inquire into the reason why the port ladder was not ready. It was then that Collard growled a remark that was to put the careers of all three men in jeopardy. "I should damn well think so, and get the commander's reasons in writing." Within 15 minutes of Royal Oak dropping her anchors, the port capstan engine had finally been persuaded to make itself useful. Collard's barge was lifting and rolling through the breaking seas, shorebound, complete with servant and luggage. Dewar hurried back to the bridge. The anchor cables were still being veered. It was another 8 minutes or so before he could give the order. Finish with main engines, secure cables. Daniel went down to the wardroom for a well-earned drink. A group of officers were talking, and he heard the words. "Another bust up on the quarterdeck?" The mercurial commander obviously decided to regard the entire episode as a joke, for he just laughed and said, "I haven't been called anything I haven't been called before," then ordered a whiskey and soda for himself and a couple of other officers. He did not know then what high words had passed between the Admiral and the flag captain. It was some time afterwards that Daniel visited the captain's cabin and was told that he had to submit an explanation in writing to the Admiral to account for the confusion on the quarterdeck. A demand for an explanation in writing from a senior officer could have two distinct effects. A simple, lucid, and justifiable account of an incident might well settle the matter there and then, and for all time. On the other hand, if not acceptable, it could be a significant smear on the record of an officer like Daniel, whose next promotion to captain would entirely be by selection and in a highly competitive field at that. Had Collard, whose volcanic temper was spectacular, but usually short-lived, received such an explanation a day or so later, the betting is a boat took to a battleship, they would have normally dismissed it with no more than a mild wonder at all the fuss. Unhappily for the rear admiral, the flag captain, and the commander, Royal Oak was about to try her hand at slapstick comedy. The court-martial over, Collard signalled that he would be returning to the ship at 17:45 hours. Stung by the admiral's bellow the day before that he could not get a single thing done as he wished, Dewar made absolutely certain that Collard would not find the most minute flaw in his flagship on his return. The gangway was lowered. This time it was obvious which was the sheltered side of the ship. The ceremonial side party was mustered. A signalman stood ready to hoist Collard's flag, for, like a monarch, an admiral's ensign is not flown in his absence. Daniel, telescope under arm, prowled the ship like an anxious housekeeper. The only possibly unhappy soul aboard was Lieutenant Commander Archie Alistair Stewart Murray. He was the second senior lieutenant commander in Royal Oak and Daniel's shadow. Mindful of Collard's instruction of only a couple of days before, that the ship would always carry her full complement of boats whenever she put to sea, Daniel had delegated him to supervise the swinging inboard of the Admiral's barge by means of a derrick. The sea and the wind had hardly abated since the day before. The waves were still quite high. There was plenty of broken water around, and Royal Oak, for all her size, was rolling in a matronly fashion. Yet it was not an impractical exercise. Murray would have cheerfully embarked any ship's launch except an Admiral's barge, and Collard's barge at that. Weighing nearly 4 tons, the idea of all that immaculate paintwork, that cherished varnish, those gilded brass dolphins, one sudden lurch of the ship, one unforgiving steel stay in the way, it was not a thing to dwell on. Murray studied the assembled ratings patiently, waiting to haul the barge inboard, and wished he had some other task to do that darkening evening. Under the heavy sky, Collard's barge was seen butting its way through the crested waves towards the ship. The ceremonial side party had assembled at the head of the gangway. Dewar, Daniel, the duty lieutenant commander, and the officer of the watch gathered some paces inboard, ready to receive their admiral with all the ceremony that had been so lacking when he had left the ship. The quarterdeck of Royal Oak was so broad that from where they were standing the barge would soon disappear under the lee of the ship's side, and the first they would see of Collard would be when he mounted the gangway and his head drew level with the edge of Royal Oak's deck. But the admiral never appeared at all. It was clear that no dire disaster had befallen him. He had not tumbled and fallen into the sea, for his familiar roar could be heard above the wind. Then, before the startled eyes of the waiting officers, the side party, standing stiffly at attention by the side of the ship, suddenly disappeared down the gangway, led by the corporal of the guard and the side boys. What had happened was that when the barge drew alongside, the rising and falling lower gangway grating one moment swilling with water, the next a foot or two out of it. Collard, the prime seaman, had waited his moment and, despite his limp, had nipped onto it with his shoes bone dry. He had been halfway up the accommodation ladder before he heard and felt the sudden surge of a rogue wave. Looking down over his shoulder, he saw his servant burdened with luggage, regalia and swordcase, awash on the lower grating. Undoubtedly, Collard's first thought was that some hundreds of pounds worth of valuable and totally uninsured kit was about to be swept away. His second, and just as certain, was why the hell there was no handling party waiting to assist his man. He raised a furious voice and had the once formally arranged side party scrambling down the ladder past him. On the quarterdeck, with all this pandemonium out of sight, all was formally aligned, patient and calm. Collard was no doubt having one of his tantrums. He had discovered some small fault on his way up the gangway and, as usual forgetting that he was an admiral, had taken matters into his own hands. No officer even bothered to step to the side of the ship and look down. It was simply one more misunderstanding. That there were no seamen waiting to help Collard's servant with his luggage was simply an account of the Admiral's direction of a couple of days earlier, namely that Royal Oak should embark all boats before sailing, including his own barge. The obvious way to deal with his luggage was to leave it in the barge until it had been swung inboard and unload it then. But either Collard had forgotten his order or, weather-wise as he was, thought, like Lieutenant Commander Murray, that hoisting the barge inboard was not worth the risk. Whatever the reason, he had not discussed it with his officers. When Collard finally reached the quarterdeck, he was in a towering fury, pausing only to lean over the side and bellow to the coxswain of the barge to return to HMS Valiant. He headed for his quarters with his flag lieutenant at his heels. On the way, he passed the rank of saluting officers without so much as a bob of his head. In front of a very fair number of Royal Oak Ship's company, he cut her captain dead. This was an insult both to the ship and himself that Dewar could never forgive. From that moment on, and as long as they were in the ship, the flag captain never spoke another direct word to the Admiral, save perhaps once. It was always the custom for Admiral and flag captain to share a midday meal together in the Admiral's quarters. Dewar elected to have luncheon alone in his own cabin, but Collard, who was as ready to make amends as he was to lose his temper, did once invite him to share his table. Dewar attended, but the evidence is that he sat and ate in total and uncomfortable silence. He was a proud Scotsman, and he had been insulted once too often. It was a ridiculous situation. Two senior officers, who had been together barely 12 weeks, now so utterly divided. As stupid as the reasons. And what were they? A few hot words at a dance, a ship's boat delayed for a few moments, a confusion over some luggage. It was even more absurd than that. Collard's appointment to Royal Oak was only for a year. Not a long time, some would say. For two utterly incompatible but highly experienced officers to broaden their shoulders and smother their feelings. But 2 days later, on the 8th of March, even Collard threw away his olive branch. On that day, the flagship was at sea again, this time in company with her sister battleships Remedies and Resolution. The original orders were that on their return to harbour from exercise, Royal Oak was to take number 12 berth and Remedies number 13. But early in the day, and for reasons known only to that bureaucratic establishment ashore that Keys had allowed to flourish, the berthing orders were reversed. Royal Oak was to use number 13, Remedies was to make for number 12. At the end of a long day at sea, and getting on for midnight, all three battleships were approaching harbour. Collard was up in his lair, keeping a watchful eye on his small fleet. Dewar on the bridge below, handling Royal Oak. Although Boy 12 was the innermost berth, and consequently Remedies should have led the way into harbour, Collard ordered Royal Oak to enter first. It is important to remember that Collard had not chosen Dewar as his flag captain. The man of his picking would undoubtedly have been someone of his own nature. Extrovert and hearty, a thoroughgoing bluff seaman, the sort of captain who in such a situation would have said to himself, "I bet the old man's not spotted the change of berthing orders," and have cheerily, but respectfully, attracted his admiral's attention. Not so Dewar. He had read the orders, and he knew it was Collard's duty to read and sign the signal log in which they were contained. At 11:30 that night, the flagship edged slowly into harbour, and headed straight for number 13 berth. The dumbfounded Collard turned on his flag lieutenant and demanded that he find out why. But Burkhardt already knew. He informed his master that the Rear Admiral Malta had amended the orders early that morning and, like Dewar, had assumed that Collard had read the signal log before he signed it. On the bridge below, Dewar had already decided that his admiral's order for the flagship to enter first was wrong. However, he reckoned that Remedies was a good half-hour steaming astern, and that, with the help of the harbour tugs, Royal Oak would be safely moored and out of the way by the time her sister ship arrived. Even so, he did not envy Remedies' captain the task of handling his ship through the narrow strip of water between Royal Oak and the massive aircraft carrier Eagle laying opposite. As it happened, things went appallingly wrong. Both tugs towing the flagship parted their hawsers, and the helpless Royal Oak swung right across the harbour, blocking the entrance. Dewar had to send for the flag lieutenant and tell him, "You had better ask the Admiral to make a signal to Remedies to keep clear while our stern is coming round." Finally the ships were safely berthed. Fortunately, it had happened so late at night that there were a few expert sightseers to observe such goings-on. Even so, there were more than enough for Collard. This time he did not fly into a fury, for he appreciated that the fault was his and his alone. Instead, he became unusually and dangerously quiet, and completely unforgiving. He had found Dewar a difficult man to handle in the past, but that was endurable. Now the man had turned out to be utterly disloyal and untrustworthy. Dewar was not only Royal Oak's captain, but also his own personal flag captain, a man who should be a confident and stout support. By not reminding him of the change of berthing orders, Dewar had proved himself totally unreliable. Most of his fellow flag officers would probably have agreed with him. Dewar, on the other hand, merely said that the idea of telling Collard about the new arrangements never entered his head. Neither officer realised how little more time they would have to enjoy each other's company. Commander Daniel had no direct part to play in the last episode, except that, as executive officer, any slur on Royal Oak's reputation for efficiency reflected on him. However, he had other things on his mind. 3 nights before, he had settled down to his Admiral's demand for a written explanation of the confusion over the gangways. He took the matter very seriously. First of all, he sought out every officer remotely concerned to find out if anything had gone wrong. Was there anything at all to justify the Admiral's complaint? Finding nothing, he retreated to his cabin and started to write. He wrote for a long time, for it was a long letter, phrased in the official parlance that years in the Royal Navy had taught him. Each paragraph was neatly numbered, and there were 11 paragraphs in all. It was a letter that was to destroy 2 careers. The first paragraph was merely preamble. The rest read as follows. 2. In the first dog watch, the flag lieutenant reported that the rear admiral required to leave the ship on our return to the anchorage, and that he was arranging for the barge to meet the ship. He also delivered a message from the rear admiral that he required me to have a boat rope yard arm group lighting cluster and Jacob's ladder ready in case it was too rough to use the accommodation ladder, as he did not wish any risk incurred of the barge being broken up. The interpretation which I placed on this message was that the immunity of the barge from damage was the primary consideration. I gave the necessary orders for the provision of the gear and for the requisite hands, adding orders for the provision of extra fenders, heaving lines, etc. 3. The gunnery programme was altered, and in consequence the time of anchoring was suddenly advanced 2 hours. This information was received at 19:30, and I immediately sent the hands to supper. 4. I made inquiries from the forebridge whether there would be any choice of sides for the rear admiral's disembarkation, and was informed in the negative, that the ship would be letting go the anchor at 20:45 stern to wind. The ship would presumably swing head to wind, and accordingly, there being no choice of sides, I ordered that the starboard accommodation ladder should be prepared for instant lowering, but it was not to be lowered without my orders. This restriction was imposed because, in my judgment, it seemed likely to be too rough for the barge to come alongside the accommodation ladder, and in any case, I anticipated plenty of time whilst the ship was swinging on her cable. I made it clear that the starboard accommodation ladder must be completely ready, and that the Jacob's ladder, boat rope, etc. were also to be ready either side. If any hitch occurred, I expected to be informed by the officer in charge, Lieutenant Lionel H. Phillips, and I personally went forward to make arrangement for the freeing of the port cable holder which had jammed the capstan engine. For this purpose, I used the remainder of the starboard watch and stayed forward in case of any mishap with the other bower anchor. As soon as any possibility of any such mishap had passed, I turned to go aft, and whilst the cable was still being paid out, I received a message that the rear admiral wished to see me. I went aft forthwith, and on arrival on the quarterdeck found a great commotion at the port ladder. Lieutenant Phillips informed me that the rear admiral had ordered the barge alongside the port side, and that he was angry because the port accommodation ladder was not down. I told him to proceed with all dispatch, and reported myself to the rear admiral. As ratings were close at hand, I made up my mind, for reasons based on previous experience, that if the admiral made any scene, I should keep complete silence, reserving my explanation until later. The admiral was indeed furious, asking me why the port ladder was not ready in spite of orders which he had given the flag lieutenant more than 2 hours ago, and he concluded by ordering me to see to it myself. I replied, "Aye, aye, sir," and took charge personally. 5. In a few moments, I reported to the captain that the barge was coming alongside, and briefly explained what had happened. The ship was now swinging to port, and although the port side was, for the time, the lee side, the ship was bearing down on any boat alongside the port side. It would certainly have been against my judgment to have used that side or the other side until the ship had swung nearly to the wind. There was considerable swell, a rather choppy sea, and sufficient wind to cause white horses. 6. The disembarkation was, however, carried out without damage and the barge shoved off at 21:15. The anchor was let go at 21:03. 7. I informed Lieutenant Phillips that I was satisfied with the way in which he had carried out my orders and that I took full responsibility for the arrangements which, as far as I know, were exactly as I had ordered, vis-à-vis starboard accommodation ladder completely ready for lowering, a Jacob's ladder, boat rope, heaving lines, fenders, and yardarm group instantly ready for either side, with plenty of officers and men standing by. 8. In the course of subsequent inquiries as to what had led up to the Admiral's fury, I learned incidentally that he had told the captain in a loud voice and heated manner, in the presence of seamen moreover, that he was fed up with the ship. My informant stated that he felt disgusted at what he considered was the insulting behaviour of the Admiral to the captain, although he did not hear in detail the rest of the abuse. Apart from wording of the last paragraph perhaps, Daniel had phrased his letter as any senior and highly experienced officer might. Unfortunately, he had more on his mind. Collard was soon to conduct an Admiral's inspection of his subdivision of the 1st Battle Squadron, including Royal Oak. As usual, it was going to be a thorough and arduous affair of drills, exercises, and scrupulous eye-searching. Already, Daniel was preaching the need for extra efficiency to his subordinate officers and ratings. At the same time, he could not help feeling bitterly that Collard was making it clearer each day that he had little respect for his flagship and that the chances of the ship and her crew having a fair and honest report were almost negligible. And anything but a good report could damn Daniel and his hopes of promotion to captain. More deeply, maybe, he felt the anger and sense of injustice of any good seaman when the ship and her crew were unfairly stigmatized. Daniel was an emotional man, a would-be actor, a hopeful playwright. The sense of drama was far too strong for him to resist. He wrote on. 9. This concludes my report on the events, but I consider it my duty to point out what serious harm is done by such incidents. On the last occasion, great pains were necessary to restore the respect of the Admiral in the public opinion of the wardroom and of the lower deck, and I feel confident that this has been achieved. This occurrence, together with and emphasised by the insult before nearly 100 officers and men at 17:45 yesterday, has had a very serious effect on discipline and morale. Among wardroom officers, those who had the mortifying experience of witnessing these scenes are inflamed with indignation, and all officers are deeply resentful of the humiliation to which they see that their captain and their ship have been subjected. 10. I myself was not personally affronted by any words used by the Admiral to me, and my sole reason for representing this state of affairs is that I consider the morale of the ship the special care of the commander, and I should be guilty of neglect and cowardice if I shrunk from asking that a protest should be made in the most generous but uncompromising way possible at your discretion. Apologies would serve no useful purpose now, but assurance is urgently necessary that discipline, which must depend upon respect for rank, will not be undermined in this way. 11. Moreover, I wish to draw your attention to the inevitable apprehensions which prevail concerning the forthcoming Admiral's inspection. The ship is discouraged. My recent appeal to look forward to the inspection, thereby making it serve a useful purpose for the efficiency of the service, has been reversed by the anticipation of vindictive fault-finding. An eminent criminal lawyer once said, Dartmoor is full of men who have made statements. He would have shaken his wig sadly had he been present when Daniel finally laid down his pen. Before the commander signed it, he sought out 5 of the most senior wardroom officers and invited them to his cabin. When they had crowded in, he read out the letter. For God's sake, stop me and don't let me send it in, he begged. If there is any doubt at all in your minds. There was not a single doubtful nor dissenting voice. When they had gone, Daniel signed the letter and addressed it to Dewar, for it was the captain who had asked for his reasons in writing, and Daniel naturally assumed that it was for his captain's eyes only, and that it would eventually come to rest in some confidential file. Then he changed his mind, and instead of sending the letter by messenger, he delivered it personally and asked Dewar how many copies were needed. Dewar answered, My secretary is shortly leaving the ship. He is absolutely trustworthy. Give it to him to type. Paymaster Lieutenant Commander Stuart Thompson Crichton, Dewar's secretary, was shown the draft letter. He read it and was extremely startled. Such a document had never come his way in his career. Without being asked, he saw the absolute need for confidentiality and typed the letter in his own cabin. Daniel was in for a shock. For his captain, that austere, remote Scot, the man who weighed every action carefully, told him that he had also decided on a line of action. After being cut dead on his own quarterdeck by his own admiral, he too had decided to write a letter. His was to be to Collard's immediate superior, Vice Admiral John Kelly, commanding the 1st Battle Squadron. He said that he intended to enclose Daniel's letter with his own. After his first astonishment, there is no evidence that the commander ever objected. It is much more significant that, on first reading Daniel's emotional letter, originally intended for his eyes alone, Dewar the pedant, a man used to the orthodox ways of flag officers, never expressed any objection to its style and passionate language, nor suggested, even mildly, that his subordinate should amend it and tone it down before others saw it. Later, it is true, he did make some gentle suggestion of the sort, but by that time Daniel, bolstered by the thought of his captain's support, would not hear of the idea.